Hello, everybody. Welcome to video one of the Foundational Obligations to Indigenous People series. Thank you so much for joining and taking the time to walk through this learning journey with us. So, we're going to do our best to provide an overview about the various reports, acts, and inquiries that we all have obligations to respond and uphold to for Indigenous peoples and really respond to them in our day-to-day work. So I'll first start off by introducing myself. My name is Jordan Hendry. I am Tsimshian and a member of Black Willem's band from my mother's side. I have Irish and Scottish ancestry on my father's side. I grew up on Tsimshian territory for most of my life in what's known as Terrace, BC. I eventually made my way down south for school about 10 years ago. So for the past 10 years, I've resided on the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, where I've been a student. I'm a current PhD student, and I'm a researcher with the Unlearning and Undoing White Supremacy and Indigenous Specific Racism Lab. So I will be walking through today's concepts with you. We're going to be learning about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People for this first session. And so before we begin, though, I actually want to point out our anchor image for this series. So we are using this photo that's here on the left, and it's a photo I took of the totem pole that's outside the BC Ministry of Health building. The totem pole is titled Crossing Cultures and Healing, and it was carved by brothers Tom and Perry Lafortune, members of Sayout First Nation. And so this pole was actually put here as an example of the government's commitment to a true and lasting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I'll share an explanation of the pole that the carvers gave from the top down. So the very top, you'll see a raven. It's a messenger of good news. Below it, you'll see an owl and its ability to see in both worlds, also in the past, the present, and the future. Next, there is a frog, which is the conscience of community. Then at the very bottom, that's kind of cut off, there is a woman, and that is the grandmother who teaches respect, humility, and resilience. And then additionally, there's a rope that connects all the figures together, and that really shows the strength and continuity. So let's hold these teachings with us as we move through this series. It's our protocol to recognize the inherent rights of First Nations that stretch to every inch of this province. And we do this in every single presentation and every single talk we do because I think it sets such a good foundation and really provides an important lens for the future work. Inherent rights, they're rooted in connection to lands and waters and have never been ceded or surrendered. Inherent rights are upheld in international, national, and provincial law through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Long-standing Indigenous laws and systems are very integrally tied to the lands and waters of these territories. Additionally, there are generations of Indigenous rights holders who are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit who come from elsewhere in Canada and also call these lands and waters homes. So really starting with this serves as a reminder to carry out all the work that we do through an Indigenous rights-based lens. So we use the term foundational obligations as shorthand for the obligations and directions we have under international, federal, and provincial law to uphold the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. So looking at the why, our obligations, legally, we've been told that, and we know very deeply, Indigenous rights exist. They exist here on these territories. Indigenous people are able to really carry out and have always had inherent rights. And they need to be upheld. These obligations are set out in our Constitution and our federal and provincial laws and our court decisions. So we have those obligations very clearly laid out. We also have the framework on how we're going to do this. We have been provided the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as the framework for reconciliation, as stated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. We also have the how. We have specific solutions to health disparities, to working towards reconciliation. They have been articulated over and over and over again by Indigenous peoples. We have over 1,000 recommendations across very key reports that are listed here. The TRC 94 calls to action, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+, calls for justice. We have the In Plain Sight recommendations, amongst others. And so I also want to note that the check marks in these three boxes, they're not things that the government have done or provided to Indigenous people. Rather, they really reflect the hard work and heavy lifting that has been done by Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have been resisting our governments at every turn, and they have been a vocal point in advocacy to get to where we are today. So that leaves us at the implementation of the action piece. It is well past our time. to really step into our responsibility and do what we've been asked to do. So our attention is here and it is incomplete, and that is a large focus of the unlearning, undoing work and why we're doing this series together so we can all kind of be at the same education field. And so that kind of leads into my goals for the series. And so the overarching goal is really for everyone to recognize Indigenous people's rights within their sphere of work. The first goal of the series is to have all team members at the same understanding of the foundational obligations to Indigenous peoples. We recognize that everyone is coming to this work from varying levels of understanding of these commitments, so it's essential that we are on the same page and level of education so you can feel confident in your team's ability to come to this work with the same lens. You can all be having the same conversations. The second is to really strengthen confidence in upholding Indigenous rights within your work and sphere of influence. Many people hesitate because they're worried about making mistakes, which is a normal thing, but the bigger risk is actually doing nothing if you don't have that confidence. And so you don't need to be an expert to take action. The goal here is to feel more grounded and equipped to step into this work, knowing that Indigenous peoples are the knowledge holders and you also have a responsibility to do this work too. The third goal is to be able to apply an Indigenous rights-based lens across all areas of your work and whether that work is Indigenous specific or not. And to me, that's a really important part. We're not just using this when we're looking at an Indigenous specific report or just looking at health impacts for Indigenous people, but all of the work that we're doing, how you show up, how decisions are made, how programs are shaped, you need to be bringing an Indigenous rights-based lens too. For me, the long-term goal is to make this type of work second nature. It's like when you are given a report and you start reviewing it, you kind of like inherently look for grammar and flow and things like that, and you're not even really thinking about it. That would be my goal, to be doing that with an inherent rights-based lens. And that kind of practice takes time, but that's what we're building towards, really building those muscles. Okay, so let's get into it. So this is what we're looking at today, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'll refer to it as UNDRIP for short. Some other people call it the Declaration. So, with the recognition that Indigenous people have always had inherent rights, we have throughout history and still to this day carried rights even during times of conflict or oppression. The challenge, though, that we've come across is being able to freely express those rights. Indigenous people have the rights to make decisions about our own lives, all the things that make up who we are, the food we eat, the land we use. And so the photo on the left here shows Indigenous people marching to protest the elimination of Indigenous rights in the proposed Constitution in 1981. And then the photo on the right shows Indigenous people marching in 2019 to defend their inherent treaty rights, right to language, despite the rights being affirmed in the Constitution and UNDRIP. The recent photo shows that we still face significant challenges in our ability to exercise those rights. I think for some, even the idea of Indigenous right or an inherent right could be confusing, and at least for me, it was at first. We really see rights as these legal rules and a Western concept, whereas Indigenous rights are not something that has been granted. They exist due to Indigenous people's occupation on this land since time immemorial. So for each group, First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, each nation, each band, maybe even each family, they might exert their rights differently. However, a very broad definition of Indigenous right is the ability to self-determine things like land, culture, resources, the same way they were able to pre-colonization. So, an example of this would be a nation's ability to determine when and how their community can fish for food, allowing the nation to control and determine what would be best for the river and their people, since they have lived there for thousands of years and have a very deep, intimate knowledge about the ways in which the river works. And I give you this example because every summer my family fishes on the Skeena River to prepare for the winter months, and we come together to smoke it and can it and prepare fish. And I think growing up, I didn't always recognize the ways in which this practice was something I have a right to, and it's a practice my family has been responsible for thousands of years. So when I say I come from the banks of the mighty Skeena River, I mean not only myself, but all the ancestors who worked and worked and lived on the banks as strong fishermen to support their community, and that has always been our right. So before we get into kind of talking about what UNDRIP is, I really want to provide the truth and the foundation of how we got here. Why is UNDRIP necessary, and what are the events that led to the current day situation? So the Doctrine of Discovery was the foundation upon which the colonial nation of Canada exists, essentially. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the Doctrine of Discovery, which stated that any land non-inhabited by Christian rulers was able to be discovered, claimed, or exploited by Christian rulers. Um, this was allowed because Europeans created the idea of um, terra nullius, meaning land belonging to nobody, and really they thought the idea that indigenous people were less than human, therefore terra nullius applied. So this was the beginning of political and legal justification for colonization and seizure of land not inhabited by Christians. The doctrine of discovery really fueled white supremacy, and it was used as a foundational document that inspired and fueled colonization all around the world. There are roughly six settler societies that, including Canada, that continue to apply this law today and restricts human rights, property rights, sovereign rights of Indigenous nations and peoples. And the Vatican did repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery in, I believe, it was March 2003, but that's not the same thing as rescinded. Canada has not repealed or removed the effects of the legal doctrine, and Canadian law still definitely incorporates elements derived from the doctrine. Things like crown sovereignty, assumed title to lands, denial of Indigenous legal orders. So while UNDRIP and Bill C-15, which we'll talk more about that bill in a bit, have begun to reject those doctrines, the full dismantling of the impact of the doctrine discovery in Canadian law has not occurred yet, but we are working towards it. I do want to point out in the Canadian UNDRIP Act, the government's current stance is that all doctrines, including the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Another document that outlines how we got here is the Royal Proclamation. Following the logic that was introduced by the Doctrine of Discovery, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 attempted to formalize how British colonial powers would continue asserting their control over Indigenous territories while also trying to maintain some appearance of legal process. And so they put this in as a kind of a guideline for European settlement on Aboriginal territories in what's now known as North America. Sometimes you'll hear me say Aboriginal over the word Indigenous, and that's kind of to comply with the legal wording about these events. So the Royal Proclamation sets a foundation for establishing treaties. Treaty making typically involved both First Nations and the Crown, and there had to be some form of consent to the treaty. But we need to look critically at how these negotiations took place. It happened at a time when colonization had already been going on for over 2 centuries. These negotiations typically were conducted in English. There was little to no interpretation. Many Indigenous nations were already experiencing the devastating impacts of colonization. We'd had the smallpox epidemics, there's displacements, loss of traditional foods. So colonization had already taken a very heavy toll. And so when we talk about consent with treaties, we have to recognize the deep power imbalances that were at play because treaties were often secured through coercion, manipulation, and not with free, informed, equitable agreements or consent. The one thing the Royal Proclamation did do was explicitly state that Aboriginal title has existed and continues to exist, and that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. And so you'll see that come into play in a lot of recent court cases that have happened, especially in BC, where it's not technically treaty land. So the Royal Proclamation forbade settlers from claiming land from Aboriginal occupants unless it had first been bought by the Crown and then sold to settlers. And it's believed that this proclamation still holds up today as no law has extinguished it. So this is one of the first formal acknowledgments in colonial law of the pre-existing rights of Indigenous nations to their land. However, while the proclamation recognized these rights in principle, the Crown's actions often contradicted this recognition and continued to assume sovereignty over lands without any genuine consent. Another example of how we got here and why UNDRIP is necessary is the additional and ongoing harmful imposition of settler colonial law. So what you see here is a timeline of just 6 examples of systems imposed through settler colonial law. Each was created and designed to have an impact on either combining or displacing or disconnecting Indigenous people from land, their ways of being, family, and kinship. So we have the reserve system, which really confined nations to very small fractions of their traditional territories. Incarceration was weaponized very early on. Criminalization of ceremonies like the potlatch led to mass arrests and incarceration. Additionally, residential schools. In BC alone, there was about 18 federal church-run schools that were part of a very deliberate system of abuse and family separation. There was also Indian hospitals, which were a site of medical segregation and abuse. Additionally, the 60 scoop, and now which has formed into the millennial scoop, is a reflection of state-led family separation, child apprehension. So many systems of harm from settler colonial law aren't even shown here. Things like the Indian Act, enfranchisement policies, and they have really deep impacts of that, legal suppression of Indigenous governance, and also, really importantly, the broader system of genocide that kind of underpins all of these systems. So this offers just a very small glimpse into the sustained assault on Indigenous rights and why frameworks like UNDRIP are needed. I'll, in just a minute, I'll get into what UNDRIP is, but it's really important to recognize the ways in which Indigenous people have had ongoing resistance. They have continuously resisted, confronted, and worked to redress the harmful effects of settler colonialism. And we are here today, even with the creation and having UNDRIP because of Indigenous people and their work. So the photo on the left, so both of these newspaper clippings, the one on the right and the left, they're about 114 years apart. The first on the left is from 1906 when four BC chiefs traveled all the way to England to meet with King Edward demanding recognition of their land rights. And then the one on the right is from about 5 years ago when Indigenous youth led a very powerful protest at the BC legislature in support of Wet'suwet'en and hereditary chiefs. There was thousands and thousands of other acts of resistance in between these two moments. Um, and just recognizing that we wouldn't be here without Indigenous people's ongoing resistance. So why was UNDRIP created? UNDRIP was created in response to the centuries of colonization, of land theft, of systemic human right violations experienced by Indigenous peoples globally. At the same time, there were existing human rights frameworks, but they didn't work for Indigenous people, and they didn't reflect the lived realities of Indigenous people. A lot of the human rights frameworks mostly focused on individual rights, like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's a very individualistic document. It didn't recognize the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, our rights to land, self-determination, to pass on culture and knowledge, to governance in accordance with their own systems of law. And so UNDRIP was created really as a result of decades of advocacy by Indigenous leaders across the globe. They pushed really hard for a declaration that actually reflects Indigenous worldviews and that would challenge kind of this colonial assumption that was embedded in international law. And so I will share in a few slides about the incredible work Indigenous people did to kind of make UNDRIP happen. So what is UNDRIP? It is the most comprehensive instrument detailing the rights of Indigenous peoples in international law. It has 46 articles that outline the minimum standards for survival, dignity, well-being of Indigenous people globally. I really see it as a statement of a global standard for Indigenous rights, for global expectations, morally, politically, legally, all of it. For Indigenous people specifically, I really see it as a message of global solidarity, political unity for Indigenous people to support one another. When the declaration was created, I was told that it was intended to be something that Indigenous people could all stand behind, while also recognizing the unique context and realities of Indigenous people in different countries and regions. On the kind of more government side, I see it as more of a roadmap or kind of a framework. And it's directions that are intended to address colonization, all the legacies, and it's intended to address the dispossession of Indigenous people from our lands and resources and work towards reconciliation. UNDRIP is the boldest recognition and description of Indigenous rights today that we currently have. So, UNDRIP isn't really laid out in any kind of linear or siloed way. One of my professors, Elsa Stematopoulos, explained to me that you have to read it diagonally, meaning you need to look across the articles to understand how rights to land, rights to culture, rights to self-determination are deeply interconnected and mutually reinforcing. UNDRIP is a very long and detailed document with 46 articles in total, and I believe it really affirms three major pillars that are central to Indigenous rights across the world, which are here on this screen. So the first one is self-determination. This is the foundational right to make decisions about our own lives, our communities, our futures. Some Indigenous rights experts say it's the most significant right in the Declaration. It really breaks the framework for what a human right was, and it's a very remarkable achievement that Indigenous people were able to get this into an international document that many countries were able to stand behind. Um, it, of course, also causes issues for certain countries, especially the Kansas states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and US. It is worrisome for some of those countries because some want to really have control over domestic politics. So the ability for a nation within a nation to have self-determination like that is a really strong wording, and it's a really strong right to have. The next one is cultural rights. UNDRIP strongly protects Indigenous cultures, our language, our ceremonies, our knowledge systems. One reason that cultural rights are so important in UNDRIP is because they are collective, and that's also what makes them so controversial. But most legal, Western legal and human rights systems are built in on the idea of individual rights, what one person is entitled to. But Indigenous rights often don't make sense in that framework, as I was just speaking to. Our cultures, our language, our ceremony, they're held collectively and they're passed through families or clans or nations, and they're not owned or exercised by individuals alone. And so cultural rights, they're about this kind of belonging amongst a group. And that's why we see these articles about culture. They've been both very powerful for Indigenous people to have them in an international document and also very contested at the UN level and at the state level, even in Canadian law. The last one we have is land rights. UNDRIP affirms that Indigenous people have the right to lands, territories, resources that they have traditionally owned, occupied, used, and or otherwise acquired. And this isn't about just economic or property rights in kind of that colonial legal sense. It's the one thing I really love the way they speak about land rights in UNDRIP is that it's very spiritual. Land is kin, it holds stories, medicines, laws, and responsibilities. And that is really aligned with Indigenous worldviews where land is not really owned, it's something we kind of live with. And it's not about extraction or ownership. It's really understanding that spirituality and the sacred obligations to land. So I'm going to go through a timeline of how UNDRIP was created. Indigenous people have been advocating on the international stage long before UNDRIP was even imagined. And I also want to recognize the timeline I have here is really just the timeline of when Indigenous people started interacting with more Western settler society. So it's this timeline does not reflect all of the resistance Indigenous people are doing way, way, way beyond 1923. But for the sake of time, that is where I will start this today. So in 1923, Descahe, a Cayuga chief of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, traveled all the way to Geneva to the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the UN, the United Nations. And he was there on behalf of Haudenosaunee as a sovereign nation. And his goal was to really seek recognition of their right to self-govern and to resist the Canadian government's attempt to unseat Six Nations Hereditary Council. However, the League of Nations secretary refused to allow him to address the assembly and arguing that Canada actually had jurisdiction over the Six Nations. While the outcome wasn't as planned, this trip really planted a seed for the work that Indigenous peoples would take up again decades later within the UN system. So in the 1970s, the international Indigenous peoples movement really got its footing. This period was marked by Canada's effort to assimilate Indigenous populations through policies like the 1969 White Paper, which proposed abolishing the Indian Act and treaties. the Six Nations and other Indigenous groups, they really strongly actively resisted these policies and went and decided, they weren't able to have enough leverage in Canada, so they sought an international support for their rights. Another significant leader from BC during this time was George Manuel Secwepemc leader, who launched the United Nations affiliated World Council of Indigenous Peoples. And they began drafting kind of a version of UNDRIP. There was actually a few different groups who had been drafting things that were documents that really outlined specific rights that Indigenous peoples had. And of course, this is a time before email, and so there wasn't necessarily a coordinated effort until this was formally put into as a working group at the UN. So the growing presence of Indigenous peoples really advocating is what pushed the UN to take Indigenous issues seriously, and that's when they formed the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982. This was also catalyzed by a landmark study by Jose R. Martinez Cobo, which documented the very widespread discrimination and human right violations experienced by Indigenous peoples globally. So it wasn't until 1994 where there was the first draft of UNDRIP that was prepared. However, progress slowed in 1994 once that draft was put out because a lot of states were very concerned with the core elements of UNDRIP, namely self-determination and control over natural resources. And at the same time, Indigenous people really refused to accept a watered-down language. They wanted something that would actually have teeth and make change. And so it was a very delicate dance between member states at the UN being okay with the document because ultimately they're the ones who are going to decide to accept it or not, versus Indigenous people globally who want a strong document that's actually going to make change. So finally, in 2007, UNDRIP goes before the General Assembly and gets adopted by a vote of 144 states in favor, 11 abstained, and 4 votes against. And let's pause for a second and think about who those 4 votes against might be. And if you guess Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and US, you are correct, the 4 settler states. You will see later on that UNDRIP wasn't formally adopted into Canadian law until 2021. And so there is roughly a 40-year gap between the idea of UNDRIP and implementation here in Canada. I also really like to remind everyone that the creation of UNDRIP, as we just kind of went over, um, UNDRIP was not gifted to us by the UN, by states. It was demanded over generations and generations by Indigenous nations who asserted their rights to be heard. So there was a decade of Canadian resistance to UNDRIP. As I just stated, in 2007, Canada was one of 4 countries that voted against the adoption of UNDRIP. Canada claimed there was concerns around land rights, free prior informed consent, and those kind of things were incompatible with domestic law. In November 2010, Canada endorsed UNDRIP, but with qualifications. The endorsement stated that UNDRIP is aspirational and not legally binding, and it really emphasized that the declaration would be interpreted in a manner that is consistent with Canada's constitution and legal framework. So in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its findings, and it called for UNDRIP to form the foundation of reconciliation in Canada. And I think this is when we really saw a big shift and change in the way Canada looked at UNDRIP. So then in 2016, Canada removed its qualifications and fully endorsed UNDRIP without objection nearly a decade after UNDRIP's initial adoption. In 2019, British Columbia passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, so they were the first province in Canada to legislate UNDRIP. Then in 2021, Canada legislated UNDRIP as Bill C-15, and it was called an Act Respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so we'll go over both the BC DRIPA and the federal UNDRIP Act in a moment. I want to point out where in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission they name UNDRIP as the framework for reconciliation. So it is here in the 10 principles of reconciliation. It is also listed as the very first one. And I think that's a very powerful place for it to be. UNDRIP is really foundational to this work moving forward. And it is again listed as the TRC call to action 43, where they called upon the government to fully adopt and implement UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. So we're first going to go over the Federal Act, Bill C-15, that was put in 2021, formally adopting UNDRIP into Canadian law. And so this legislation really affirms that UNDRIP is a universal international human rights instrument with application in Canadian law. It's not just a symbol that is there. It is really meant to shape how our laws and policies in this country will operate, and has already began doing so. The government did many virtual engagement sessions with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders, modern treaty holders, different Indigenous organizations, women organizations, youth organizations in the lead up to creating this act. And so I'm going to talk about kind of three main commitments that the act has in it. And so the first one, and probably what I consider the most far-reaching piece, is the requirement for a full review of existing federal laws to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration, so the alignment of laws. This will be a very long process. There are lots of laws and policies that are out of alignment with the intent and spirit of the UN Declaration. So that's the first one. The second is the National Action Plan. The Act mandated the development of this action plan be co-developed with Indigenous peoples. That plan has now been published. It was released in June 2023. And then third is the annual reporting. So the federal government is required to report annually on the progress towards implementing UNDRIP, and that is meant to provide some form of public accountability. So far there's been, I believe, 4 reports, starting from 2022 until 2025. I do want to note, though, it's important to recognize it is the government reporting on itself. There is no external process that they take. So just keep that in mind when you're reviewing these reports. They are self-grading. So this is the action plan that accompanied the Canadian UNDRIP Act. It is from 2023 until 2028. It's another step in the journey towards implementing UNDRIP. It's not an endpoint. It offers a path towards reconciliation. And really, it can't be just a static document. It needs to be something that's evolving. It's in a 5-chapter structure that reflects kind of distinct rights and needs for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, modern treaty partners, while also identifying specific areas of urgency. So moving to the provincial UNDRIP. So BC implemented Bill 41 in 2019, which is also called DRIPA. And so this was developed in collaboration with the First Nations Leadership Council at the direction of First Nations. And this act is almost identical to the federal act. It's very similar. First is the same. All laws need to be aligned with UNDRIP. So they're going to go through all past laws, line by line, making sure everything aligns with UNDRIP, which again will take a very long time. And then all future laws also need to be aligned with the spirit and intent of UNDRIP. Again, provincial action plan. The action plan was released, and we'll go through that shortly. Annual reporting, same thing. And then the additional piece that is in our provincial UNDRIP Act versus the federal one is the shared decision making. And so this is explicitly enabled in Section 7 and allows formal shared decision making agreements with Indigenous governments based on DRIPA. So the action plan outlines how the province will work towards implementing UNDRIP in very tangible ways. It's from 2002 to 2007. There are 4 main goals in it, 89 priority actions. And these range from creating new laws and policies to changing institutional structures to funding Indigenous-led work. All actions identified in the action plan are to be implemented in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous people in BC as described in the Declaration Act. And so the action plan is really meant to help everyone who lives in BC understand the importance of reconciliation. And I'm going to highlight just a two really brief points that really stood out to me of this action plan. I really love that they included this distinction-based approach. It's a recognition of the diversity of Indigenous people in this province. There's over 200 First Nations communities in BC here with a land base, as well as so many other First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities. Um, so recognizing us all as distinct, rights-bearing communities, and being really committed to a distinction-based approach is a great way forward. Additionally, something that really stood out to me is that the action plan is explicit about the need to address Indigenous specific racism as one of the root causes of inequity. And so this means taking action to identify, challenge, and eliminate and change kind of the policies and practices that really perpetuate Indigenous specific racism. So now I'm going to talk about implementation for the next few slides. So how standards like UNDRIP become the norm. So these three steps here are based on the norm socialization model, and this was shared with me by Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot. And the first one is strategic adoption. This is the starting point. Governments formally adopt UNDRIP into law. Canada, this looks like Bill C-15 at the federal level. In BC, it's DRIPA. And both of those were already passed into law. And so things like this signal intent, but adoption alone doesn't change systems. And so that's when we get to step two, habitualization. And this is where we kind of see more change begin. UNDRIP being routinely used across policies, programs, everyday decisions. Examples of this could be requiring policy proposals to include DRIPA lens or reference to articles of UNDRIP. Maybe using UNDRIP to assess whether programs uphold Indigenous jurisdiction in health decision making. And then that gets us to norm internalization, which is the ultimate goal. This is the long-term goal where UNDRIP is not just something we refer to, but something it's a living and breathing document. It becomes part of an institutional identity or culture. And so, for example, leadership and staff, they're kind of acting on Indigenous rights reflexively, embedding self-determination in all forms of work, whether that's writing policy, designing programs, or making funding decisions, etc. So how can we use UNDRIP? It's so important to recognize UNDRIP is for everyone. It is for governments, institutions, professionals, programs, systems, individuals. We can all use this and uphold this in our day-to-day work and life. We can ask ourselves, are the decisions I'm making upholding the rights outlined in UNDRIP? Am I reinforcing colonial control? Am I shifting power? Am I supporting Indigenous self-determination? We can choose to do this in our everyday actions, or we can choose not to. It's a choice. UNDRIP can be used as a lens for reviewing policies, decisions, practices, as a tool to support Indigenous self-determination, or as a standard to hold systems accountable. Implementation starts with embedding rights into everyday work. Self-reflection time. So I want us all to take 2 minutes to jot down actions that we can begin taking to support UNDRIP implementation within our own sphere of influence. I really want to try to contextualize everything we just learned over the last few slides. And so I'll have a few examples that I want to share first. So naming that Indigenous inherent rights exist everywhere. Maybe learning the articles of UNDRIP that relate to your work and name them continuously in work initiatives. Asking who should have been in the room before this decision was made. And pausing to ask, how would this change if this decision were made in partnership with Indigenous nations? So I'll give everyone a few minutes to reflect and answer this question on the slide. So part of your homework was to read UNDRIP report, as well as identify an article from UNDRIP that you feel you can have an impact on within your work. And so that was the first step, kind of naming that connection. And now we're going to ask you to go a bit deeper. What will it take to uphold that article in your context? Do you fully understand the article, or do you need to do more homework to understand its context and its history? What needs to shift? Who do you need to be in relationship with? And what barriers might arise? And how will you respond? So, this is the final self reflection for this workshop, and I'll give everyone a few minutes to do this. Thank you so much for learning with me and going through what UNDRIP is and trying to be on the same page of understanding it. I am also on my learning journey, and I am just sharing with you what I understand UNDRIP to be and the ways I have began to embed it in my everyday work. And I really, really encourage you to continue learning. The education journey doesn't stop here. So thank you so much, and I'll see you at the next series.